deal. Bust out the windows, put his family on food stamps now. He's a big spender, no food on the table, and the bills ain't paid, cause he's spending on cigarettes and PGA. They'll turn us all into beggars, cause they're easier to please. They're feeding our people that government cheese.
That's right, say no to that government cheese. This is Chad Mitchell of the Libertopian Podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in on this May 9th, 2012 edition. We've got plenty of articles to talk about today. I will be writing solo, so hopefully this podcast will be much more condensed than the previous ones have been when Chris is on. Every time Chris is on, we start ranting and raving, and we just go way past the allotted time that the podcast is actually supposed to be. So we're actually going to try to do a better job at that as far as making sure that this podcast isn't an hour and a half long every time we do it. But thanks again for tuning in. I would like to throw a shout out to F.A. Hayek. Yesterday was his birthday, and although Hayek is no longer with us, he was a brilliant economist, one of the most famous Austrian economists, and most notably famous for writing The Road to Serfdom, which even people who aren't in the Austrian camp, including Milton Friedman and many other free market thinkers, really loved his work on Road to Serfdom, and also earned him a Nobel Prize as well in economics, which I've always said that there's only two people who earned the economics prize from the Nobel Committee who actually deserved it. And one was Milton Friedman, the other one was F.A. Hayek. So shout out to Hayek real quick. I would say that if you haven't seen, it's on the Libertopian Podcast or Libertopian Network Facebook page. I do have a posting from yesterday that has the Keynes versus Hayek rap on it. If you haven't seen that rap, it's very entertaining, and it really, from anyone who knows economics really well and understands the business cycle, understands what the Federal Reserve is doing to the money, if you have just a small amount of understanding around that, you can really grasp what F.A. Hayek is saying in that Keynes versus Hayek rap. So definitely check that out if you haven't. Going straight into the news today, though, there is some very disturbing things out there. Not going to touch on really economics too much today because there's some civil liberty issues that I really have to tackle. With this being the Libertopian Podcast, you have to touch on civil liberties, and this is something that a lot of times conservatives aren't as good on as they should be. Even though a lot of it has to do with constitutional questions, and conservatives should be all about the Constitution. For some reason, they see it as hippie or liberal to talk about some of these issues. Although on one of these, on both of these, it shouldn't be a civil liberties issue for conservatives where they disagree with it. It should be something that, hey, we need to take care of this. This is a huge infringement on the rights of the people. And the first one that I want to talk about is, this is from PrisonPlanet.com. Congressional Democrats introduce an amendment to outlaw self-defense. Now, this is just incredible. This is basically a response to the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin situation. And I haven't really given my take on that simply because I want the justice process to go its course. If Zimmerman is guilty of a crime, I want him to receive justice. If he's not guilty of a crime, I want him to be set free. And I don't want any more talk about it. I don't want people, having race riots and mobs in the street and all of that. And a lot of that's gone on because for whatever reason in America, you're no longer innocent until proven guilty. You're just, automatically guilty. If it looks like you did it, then we're just going to say, you're guilty. Or if it looks like, obviously, Zimmerman shot Trayvon, but if it looks like it wasn't self-defense, even though that hasn't been proven in a court of law, we're going to go ahead and deliver judgment on it. But this is a response to that, where you've got basically the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which in itself, that name by itself should give you a clue to the type of communist radicals that are definitely probably running that committee overall. But basically, you aren't allowed to defend yourself, and we're going to pull federal funding from your state. See, this is how it works. What the federal government does to the states is, number one, through the income tax, they directly tax the citizenry, which was initially illegal underneath the Constitution, but through that amendment, they directly tax the citizen. And so they circumvent the states. And then they give the money back to the states to initiate federal programs or to fight crime or whatever the case is. But if you do something that the federal government doesn't like, they'll pull that funding from you. So that's a major problem right there, and it's how the entire process works now, where the states have basically been neutered, and they're going to be forced into basically trying to tell their citizens of whichever state it is that, hey, you can't defend yourself. If someone comes up to you on the street and starts beating you, well, you just better just lay there and take it, right? I mean, you better just curl up in a little ball and say, try to hit me on the left side, not the right side, or something like that, maybe spank my butt or something. I don't really know what they want people to do. They just want you to be dependent upon the government for your safety, and this is all about the power monopoly of the state, and the fact that they don't want anyone, number one, to have a gun, and number two, even with your fist, even if you're trained on how to defend yourself hand-to-hand combat style, you can't do it. In fact, a Navy SEAL was barred from going into England because he was trying to teach self-defense. So apparently it's the same problem with Great Britain. They don't want their citizens defending themselves either. So it's pretty crazy. It's insane that the government is doing this. I'm not incredibly surprised by it, but I know most Americans don't care. They're living in zombie land, drinking up the fluoride and listening to the TV and watching soap opera, whatever they're doing. I don't even know what people are doing anymore. They're just, I'm really not sure. I watch TV, and I'm not a complete idiot, so I don't really know what the issue with people are and why they aren't standing up to this type of tyranny. The second article that I want to tackle is, and most likely, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have seen the Army Re-Education Camp Manual that came out this past week. It was broken by Infowars.com, but it has also been reported on a couple other websites, and the actual document is FM 3-39.40, Internment and Resettlement Operations. There's a PDF on the Army.mil website of this document, and it's pretty amazing what the document says. What it says basically is that American citizens or foreign adversaries can be put into re-education camps where they will be suppressed and where they will be taught the benefits of U.S. policy and why U.S. policy is good. And it's pretty astounding. They're talking about these types of camps in the United States of America. And it's basically like 1984 on steroids. But most Americans don't care. Most Americans will never know that this document came out. It won't be on ABC News. It won't be on Fox News. It won't be on any of the mainstream news websites. And I know some people think that Fox News is somehow alternative. Fox News is not alternative. They're just as much as a part of the mainstream media as anyone else. And they won't touch it. They won't talk about it. And the fact of the matter is, this document is a confession by the government on what they have planned for the American people. And the fact is that they're using terrorism as a fear tactic to try to gain more power. But the reality is, the real enemies of the state are the American people, according to the state. The state believes that the American people are the real threat here, and it's pretty astounding that obviously this got leaked. The Army came out with a PR campaign, I should say, today, where they basically came out and said that this was not intended for public release, and that doesn't apply to American citizens. Although in the document itself, if you read the document, which that's the key, they don't expect the American people to read the document because they don't think that the American people can read, because most Americans are almost functionally illiterate, so it doesn't really necessarily matter. They can't read, they just have to listen to whatever the government says. But basically they said that it didn't apply to American citizens, but in the document itself, it says that it does apply to American citizens. So it's pretty astounding that, that number one, this would leak, and number two, that they would just whitewash it like this. But I've come to not really be incredibly surprised by what the government will do, what they will say, to basically try to whitewash anything that comes out. They did the same thing with the MIAC Homeland Security reports, where it said gun owners, libertarians, conservatives are the real enemy of the state here, and all these counterterrorism policies that we're pushing, Homeland Security, TSA, it's all for those class of citizens, especially returning veterans. Because returning veterans, on average, have woken up and they see the state as their enemy, and they know that when society breaks down, if we have an economic collapse or we have some sort of other collapse, and they try to force the American people into these camps, that the average military man is not going to go along with it. And they are trained in hand-to-hand combat. They are trained on how to use a weapon, and they aren't going to stand by and allow this tyrannical government to operate this way. So that's my take on the new document that came out of the Army for the re-education camps. And the thing is, I should be just blown away. Americans should be rioting right now. If the founders were living right now, okay, they would be up in arms. They would be going to the Capitol, and they would be protesting. And I'm not talking about getting a permit and going and protesting. I'm talking about going up there right now with their guns and protesting. Because it's an open attack on the Constitution of the United States of America. So I'm not calling for violence, but the reality is that you've got the American people are not Americans anymore in the classic sense. They've been so dumbed down, so domesticated, that, you know, we hear about re-education camps. Well, we know that the Soviets did that. We know that the Nazis had concentration camps, but we're just too tired to debate it. We're just too tired to try to protest what the government is doing. So the reality is, I don't see much coming out of this, unfortunately, but we really should get up in arms about it. If you really read the document, it just would blow anyone away. On the good news front, though, Ron Paul is snagging delegates everywhere he's going. In fact, many GOP insiders are getting very nervous with this delegate strategy that Ron Paul is playing, because everywhere he's going, he's getting more delegates than Mitt Romney. Right? And it might not be enough delegates to get ahead of Romney, but surely enough that could possibly deny Romney the nomination. And so he's basically swept Maine and Nevada of delegates, and he's moving on up. And there is mathematically, he could get enough delegates to win the nomination. I don't think that would happen. They would pull some sort of shenanigans to keep him out, but it is interesting to see that he's going to have a say come Tampa. When it comes down to the convention, Ron Paul will have a say. And I'm excited for him, but then I'm also nervous for him, because when you mess with the establishment this way, things just seem to happen to you. Right? I mean, we look at the situation with Breitbart, which is accelerated last week. I don't think we talked about it last week. I think I intended to talk about it with Chris, but we didn't talk about it. But Andrew Breitbart's coroner just happens to pass away. He was poisoned. Arsenic, I think. And no one says anything. Not suspicious. You know, Breitbart, he was going to release a bunch of information on Obama that was supposed to be damning. Most likely it was going to tie him into some sort of communist meeting where they were probably talking about putting Americans in re-education camps. If the truth was known, that's probably what Breitbart was going to release. Then the day he's going to release it, he just winds up dead. And so then you look at his coroner getting poisoned, and now it looks like someone else has died related to Breitbart. I can't remember exactly who it was that died, but regardless, anytime you are directly attacking the elite, depending on what you have and how damning it can be, and whether or not it's something that the media will push to the forefront, they'll take you out. They will find a way to take you out. And the coroner probably knew something about Breitbart's death that showed that it was foul play and that he was actually murdered. And they found that out, and they went ahead and poisoned him. And they knew that since they controlled the media, no one would say anything about it. But that is basically what you can expect from the mainstream media. Going on, I know that I said I wasn't going to talk about economics, but I did find something interesting in Ron Paul's subcommittee hearing yesterday on monetary policy, and I did want to talk about it a little bit. Representative Brady, I believe his name is Kevin Brady, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Representative Kevin Brady, who is the vice chairman of the Joint Economic Committee in Congress, is passed, or not passed, but has proposed the Brady Sound Dollar Act, where basically he is trying to rein the Fed in. And I can't say that I don't support that. There are a few questions that I have about the Sound Dollar Act. A few of them Congressman Ron Paul asked Kevin Brady about yesterday. He basically just talked about more of a Chicago school approach to rein the Fed in, where we set the Fed target on inflation much lower, maybe around 2%. Keeping a sound dollar and stable prices is really what the original Fed mandate was, as if the gold standard didn't do a good job at that. To read directly from Mr. Brady's quote, "The Federal Reserve's monetary experimentation of the last decade must end," Mr. Brady told a luncheon crowd at the Yale Club hosted by Shadow Market Committee. "Congress should give the Federal Reserve a single mandate for price stability, and the Federal Reserve should return to a rules-based system of inflation targeting to achieve that mandate." Mr. Brady rejected the supposition that the U.S. will be taken over by China in this century, but he warned that to avoid that fate, we have to get our monetary policy right and our fiscal policy right so that our free market system can flourish. "The sound dollar is crucial to that outcome," the congressman said, "and this means strengthening the Fed's independence," quote, narrowing its mandate and making it accountable. Now, what I want to know is how do you strengthen the Fed's independence and still hold it accountable, right? Because as soon as you start trying to hold the Fed accountable, then they're going to say that the Federal Reserve is caving to political pressure. That's almost like saying that just because the whole idea of the Fed's crazy, but let's assume, just for argument's sake, that we had another system, not really another system of government, but just like you have the Federal Reserve, let's say we have the fiscal committee, okay? It's not even a committee with Congress members on it. It's just individual bureaucrats that set fiscal policy for the United States of America. And that every time they were, people tried to rein them in or hold them accountable for spending, they said, oh, it's caving underneath political pressure. So they basically pretend that there shouldn't be any political pressure when you have a private central bank managing your currency for you. And so I'm not really sure what he means by strengthening the Fed's independence and narrowing its mandate, but also making it accountable. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. If you're going to hold it accountable, then they're going to say that the Fed is less independent. If the Fed was more independent, then it would be harder to hold it accountable. So I don't think the Fed has a problem with its own independence. I think it has a problem with the accountability issue. And the reality is that I don't understand why we need a rules-based system of inflation to begin with. Why is there a target hit for inflation? Why do we need inflation? They're basically saying that we're going to have about a 2% productivity gain every year, so therefore we have to have a 2% inflation rate to offset that extra productivity. That way prices don't fall. Well, you're robbing the American people of price decreases. Why can't the American people have the lower prices? Why do you have to inflate the currency by even 2%? You're stealing money away from their paycheck. And most Americans don't know that because most Americans don't know anything about monetary policy. But the reality is that you're stealing that money from them. Even though the inflation is not out of control, even a 2% inflation, I don't understand why we're targeting that. Why can't we target a sound dollar? Why can't we target a gold standard? Why don't we get rid of legal tender laws? And why don't we allow for competing currencies as F.A. Hayek talked about in his book Choice in Currency? So there are many things that we can do, but the Chicago school approach, where you only look at the past 40 years of Fed policy and then pretend like it's all the fault of the dual mandate, and you don't want to even talk about what happened when the Fed did have a single mandate in the 1920s and then in the 1930s. You don't even want to talk about that. In fact, when Ron Paul brought that up to Kevin Brady, Representative Brady said that, "I learned a long time ago, Dr. Paul, not to question your monetary understanding of history." So basically, you know more about monetary history than I do. I don't think anyone knows more than you do on it, but the problem is it didn't answer the question. Ron Paul asked you if even with the Federal Reserve having a single mandate, if they are manipulating interest rates in the market, doesn't that cause malinvestments? Doesn't that cause distortions in the market that could affect where investment is directed and whether or not that investment will be risked improperly, and therefore could cause a downturn, could cause a depression, could cause the liquidation of debt that would need to occur afterwards. So that's all I have on the Brady Sound Dollar Act. I'm supporting the act just because it's a move in the right direction, but I do have some major questions about this Chicago school, Milton Friedman monetary policy that's being pursued. It almost seems like it's just another ruse to try to prop up the Federal Reserve and keep that institution in place when it should be eliminated, and we should go back to really choice in currency and a real free market economy, free market all the way around, not just in fiscal policy, but also monetary policy. We need to not only rein that institution in, we need to figure out a way to eliminate that institution. So I'm going to wrap up the podcast for today with that. Thanks again for tuning in to the Libertopian Podcast on this May 9th, 2012 edition. I will see you guys next week.